I was sitting in my doctor's office, getting my blood pressure medication adjusted, when my phone buzzed with a photo that made my heart stop. My son, Marcus, who had been begging me for money for months, standing next to a brand new Porsche in front of the Eiffel Tower. My name is Linda Morrison, and at 72 years old, I thought I knew my children. I raised 3 kids as an elementary school teacher in suburban Denver, always believing that love and trust were the foundation of family. My husband Robert and I had been married for 48 beautiful years before cancer took him 2 years ago, leaving me to navigate this world alone for the first time in decades. The moment I saw that photo, my hands started shaking so badly that I nearly dropped my phone right there in Dr. Patterson's office. There was my son Marcus, all 45 years of him, grinning like he'd won the lottery. His arm was casually draped over the hood of what looked like a $90,000 sports car, the Eiffel Tower gleaming in the background like something out of a movie. But it wasn't the luxury that made my blood run cold. It was the caption he'd written underneath: "Living my best life in Paris, day 3 of the European adventure." Day 3. That meant he'd been there for days, living it up in one of the most expensive cities in the world, while I'd been lying awake at night, worrying about whether he could make his rent payment. You see, for the past 6 months, Marcus had been calling me at least twice a week with increasingly desperate stories about his struggling landscaping business. Just last Tuesday, he'd called me in tears, telling me how his truck had broken down and he couldn't afford the repairs. He said he was terrified of letting down his employees, that his ex-wife was threatening to take him back to court for more child support, and that his kids, Emma and Jake, might not have proper winter coats this year. His voice had cracked when he mentioned the coats, and like a fool, I'd transferred another $2,000 to his account that very evening. Hey, beautiful soul. Before we dive in, show some love with a like, tap subscribe, and tell me, where in this big, beautiful world are you watching from? I remember hanging up that phone call, feeling so proud of myself for being able to help my son during his difficult time. Robert had always taught me that family comes first, and even though money was tighter since his death, I believed it was my duty as a mother to make sure my children were okay. I'd already dipped into my emergency savings fund multiple times to help Marcus, telling myself that this was exactly what Robert would have wanted me to do. But staring at that photo in the doctor's office, I realized I hadn't been helping my son at all. I'd been funding his vacation to Europe while he painted himself as a struggling single father who could barely keep the lights on. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow, right there in that sterile medical office with its fluorescent lights and antiseptic smell. Dr. Patterson was asking me something about my medication dosage, but his voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. All I could think about was how Marcus had looked me straight in the eye just weeks ago, talking about his children going without, while apparently planning this elaborate European getaway with my money. That's when I knew my life was about to change forever. To understand how deep this betrayal cut, you need to know the story of who Marcus used to be, and more importantly, who I thought he still was. Marcus had always been my charmer. Even as a little boy, he could talk his way out of trouble with that crooked smile and those big brown eyes that looked just like his father's. While his older sister Sarah was the responsible one, getting straight A's and following every rule, Marcus was the one who convinced the neighborhood kids to build elaborate forts and talked the ice cream truck driver into giving everyone extra treats. Robert used to joke that Marcus could charm the birds out of the trees. But charm, I was learning, could be a dangerous gift. After Robert's funeral 2 years ago, I found myself drowning in paperwork and financial decisions I'd never had to make alone. Robert had handled all our investments, insurance policies, and major financial planning. Suddenly, I was sitting at our kitchen table with stacks of documents, trying to figure out life insurance payouts, Social Security benefits, and how to manage money that had always been our money, but was now just mine. That's when Marcus stepped in. He started coming over twice a week, helping me sort through Robert's papers and explaining things in terms I could understand. He'd sit in Robert's chair at the kitchen table, patient and gentle, walking me through bank statements and investment accounts. For the first time since Robert's death, I felt like maybe I wasn't completely alone in this world. Marcus had been divorced for 3 years by then. His ex-wife, Jennifer, had remarried and moved to the other side of town, taking Emma and Jake with her. Marcus got them every other weekend and Wednesday evenings, and he'd often bring them over to my house afterward. Those grandchildren were the light of my life, especially after losing their grandfather. Emma, now 14, was starting to look so much like her father, with that same mischievous glint in her eye. Jake, 12, was quiet and thoughtful, always asking deep questions about life and death that reminded me of Robert. Marcus had started his landscaping business right after the divorce, claiming he wanted to be his own boss and build something he could eventually pass down to his kids. It sounded noble, and I was proud of him for wanting to create his own legacy. But as the months went on, the business seemed to lurch from one crisis to another. First, it was equipment breaking down. Then it was clients not paying on time. Then it was his truck needing major repairs. Each crisis came with a phone call where Marcus would sound genuinely distressed, his voice heavy with the weight of disappointing his children and failing as a provider. He never directly asked for money at first. Instead, he'd share his problems, like a son confiding in his mother. And I'd offer to help because that's what mothers do. The amounts started small, 100 here, 300 there. But over 6 months, those small amounts had added up to over $15,000 from my savings account. I justified each transfer by telling myself that Robert would want me to help our son get back on his feet, that this was temporary, and that Marcus would pay me back once his business stabilized. I'd been so focused on being the supportive mother that I'd never stopped to question whether the son I was supporting actually existed anymore. The photo that shattered my world wasn't even meant for me. That's what made it so much worse. The casual, accidental way my son's deception unraveled right there in my doctor's office. Marcus had meant to send that Porsche picture to his friends, probably to show off his European adventure. Instead, in his excitement or carelessness, he'd sent it to our family group chat, the one that included me, my daughter Sarah, my sister Margaret, and even his ex-wife Jennifer, who we'd kept in the loop for the grandchildren's sake. Within seconds of that photo appearing on my phone screen, I could see the 3 dots indicating that other people were typing responses. My sister Margaret was the first to react. "Wait, isn't this the same Marcus who needed money for truck repairs last week?" Then Sarah chimed in, "Mom, please tell me you didn't give him money for this." But it was Jennifer's message that cut the deepest. I knew something was up. Emma mentioned her dad had been posting vacation pics all week, but I thought she was confused. This explains why he was 3 hours late returning the kids last Sunday. He was probably at the airport. I sat there in that doctor's office, watching my family dissect my stupidity in real time through text messages. Each new message was like a slap in the face, revealing just how obvious Marcus's deception had been to everyone except me. Dr. Patterson was still talking about blood pressure medication, but all I could hear was the sound of my phone buzzing with more revelations about my son's lies. The worst part was reading Jennifer's follow-up message. "Linda, I'm so sorry. The kids have been talking about Daddy's work trip to Europe for weeks. I should have said something, but I thought maybe his business was finally doing well. Work trip to Europe. He'd even lied to his own children about why he was gallivanting around Paris while telling me he couldn't afford their winter coats." My hands were shaking as I scrolled back to look at that photo again. Marcus wasn't just standing next to any Porsche. He was leaning against it with the casual ownership of someone who'd bought it himself. The way his hand rested on the hood, the keys visible in his other hand, the smug satisfaction in his smile. This wasn't a borrowed car or a rental for a special occasion. This was his car, bought with money he'd extracted from his grieving mother through manipulation and lies. I managed to excuse myself from Dr. Patterson's office, claiming I felt dizzy and needed some air. But as I sat in my car in the medical center parking lot, my phone rang. Marcus's name lit up the screen, and I knew he'd finally realized his mistake. "Mom, hey, about that photo." His voice, had that nervous, guilty tone I remembered from when he was 8 years old and had broken something valuable. "Which photo would that be, Marcus?" I kept my voice steady, though my heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. "The one from Paris. Look, I can explain everything. It's not what it looks like. The car belongs to a friend, and I'm here on business. A big landscaping contract fell through, but this European client wanted to meet in person, and the lies just kept pouring out of him, each one more ridiculous than the last. A European landscaping client who flew him to Paris? A friend who just happened to own a Porsche and let Marcus pose with it in front of tourist attractions. Marcus?" I interrupted, my voice colder than I'd ever heard it. "Stop talking." But he couldn't stop. The panic in his voice was rising as he realized his elaborate deception was crumbling. "Mom, you have to understand. I was going to tell you about the business opportunity, but I didn't want to get your hopes up if it didn't work out." That's when I hung up. For the first time in my 72 years, I hung up on one of my children, and as I sat there in that parking lot, I realized that the son I'd been trying to help for months didn't actually exist. The real Marcus was apparently the kind of man who could look his widowed mother in the eye and lie without flinching. That night was the longest of my life since Robert's death. I couldn't bring myself to go to bed, so I found myself sitting in Robert's old brown leather recliner, the one that still smelled faintly of his cologne and the peppermint candies he always kept in the side pocket. The house felt impossibly quiet, the kind of silence that amplifies every creak and settles like a weight on your chest. I kept staring at my phone, scrolling through Marcus's Instagram account that my granddaughter Emma had helped me find months ago. Post after post revealed the scope of his deception. There he was at the Colosseum in Rome 5 days ago, holding up an expensive bottle of wine. Before that, luxury hotel rooms in Barcelona with room service spread across king-sized beds. Shopping bags from high-end stores in London. Every single post was stamped with locations that would have cost thousands of dollars to visit, let alone enjoy the way Marcus clearly had been. But it wasn't just the money that was eating at me. It was the surgical precision with which he'd manipulated my emotions. I remembered the exact conversation from 3 weeks ago when he'd called me, his voice breaking as he told me about Emma needing a winter coat. He'd described how she'd been wearing her old one from 2 years ago, how the zipper was broken, and it was too small for her growing frame. He'd painted such a vivid picture of his daughter shivering at the bus stop that I'd immediately offered to buy the coat myself. "No, Mom," he'd said, and I could hear what sounded like tears in his voice. "I need to be able to provide for my own kids. I just need a little help with the truck repairs, and then the business will turn around. I promise." Sitting in Robert's chair, I realized that Marcus had been watching me grieve, studying my vulnerabilities like a predator studies prey. He knew that mentioning the grandchildren would break down any resistance I might have. He knew that as a widow, still learning to navigate finances alone, I was desperate to feel useful and needed. He'd weaponized my love for my family against me. The betrayal felt like losing Robert all over again, but in a different way. When Robert died, I'd lost my partner, my best friend, the man who'd shared my life for nearly 5 decades. But his love for me had never been in question. Even in his final days, weak from cancer treatments, he'd held my hand and told me how proud he was of the woman I'd become, how much our life together had meant to him. Marcus's betrayal was different. It made me question everything I thought I knew about being a mother, about love, about trust. Had I raised a son who could look at his grieving mother and see an opportunity? Had all those years of bedtime stories, school plays, and family dinners somehow produced a man who felt entitled to my money and my pain? I found myself pulling out a photo album Robert and I had made years ago. One of those old-fashioned ones, with the plastic sleeves where you slide pictures in manually. There was Marcus at age 6, gap-toothed and grinning, holding up a crayon drawing he'd made of our family. All stick figures with enormous smiles, standing in front of a house with smoke curling from the chimney. At age 12, in his Little League uniform, beaming with pride after hitting his first home run. At 17, nervous and handsome in his prom tuxedo, standing next to Robert in our front yard. When had that innocent boy become someone who could lie so effortlessly? When had those brown eyes, that used to sparkle with mischief, learned to fake tears over imaginary financial crises? The worst part was the lonely realization that I might never know the real Marcus again. For months, I'd been having conversations with someone who didn't exist. A struggling businessman, a devoted father worried about providing for his children, a son who needed his mother's help to get back on his feet. That person was a fiction, carefully crafted to extract maximum sympathy and money from a woman who loved him unconditionally. As dawn broke through my living room windows, I was still sitting in Robert's chair, surrounded by tissues and old photo albums. I hadn't slept a minute, but something had crystallized in those dark hours. I wasn't just heartbroken, I was angry, and for the first time since Robert's death, that anger felt like something I could use. By 6 a.m., I was wide awake and functioning on a strange mixture of fury and determination. Instead of wallowing in self-pity, I decided to do something I'd never done before in my 72 years. I was going to investigate my own son like a detective. I started with my bank account. Robert had always handled our finances, but after his death, I'd learned to navigate online banking out of necessity. I logged in and began printing out every transaction from the past 6 months. Seeing it all laid out in black and white was staggering. $2,000 for truck repairs, $1,500 for business equipment, $800 for his kids' school supplies, $3,200 for payroll when his biggest client supposedly didn't pay. The list went on and on, totaling $15,400 that I'd transferred to Marcus's account. But the real treasure trove was social media. My granddaughter Emma had patiently taught me how to use Instagram months ago, showing me how to follow family accounts and look at photos. What I discovered made my stomach turn. Marcus's account was public, meaning anyone could see his posts, and he'd been documenting his entire European adventure in real time. The timeline was damning. The day after I'd sent him $2,000 for emergency truck repairs, he'd posted a photo from a first-class airplane seat, champagne glass in hand, with the caption, "Off to make dreams come true." 2 days later, he was posting from the Hotel Georges Vives in Paris, a place I looked up online that cost over $800 per night. While I'd been lying awake worrying about his financial struggles, he'd been staying in one of the most expensive hotels in the world. I screenshot everything. Every luxury meal, every expensive hotel, every shopping spree in designer stores. I organized them chronologically and cross-referenced them with my bank transfers. The pattern was sickeningly clear. Every time I sent money, Marcus's lifestyle got more extravagant. But then I found something even more revealing. In his Instagram stories, the temporary posts that disappear after 24 hours, Marcus had been bragging to his friends about his investment strategy. In one video from a Barcelona restaurant, he was laughing with friends, saying, "You just have to know how to work the system. Family guilt is worth its weight in gold." Family guilt is worth its weight in gold. My own son had reduced his manipulation of his grieving mother to a catchphrase for his friends' entertainment. I also discovered that Marcus had been planning this trip for months. His Facebook account, which he probably thought I didn't know how to access, showed conversations with travel agents dating back to January. He'd booked the Porsche rental in December, right around the time he'd started calling me with increasingly desperate financial emergencies. The most damaging evidence came from his ex-wife, Jennifer. When I called her that morning, she was horrified to learn about the money I'd been sending. She revealed that Marcus had been taking the children to expensive restaurants every weekend, buying them elaborate gifts, and had even purchased Emma a $300 pair of designer sneakers just 2 weeks ago. The same weekend, he'd called me crying about not being able to afford their winter coats. Jennifer agreed to forward me text messages where Marcus had bragged about his European business expansion and mentioned how easy it was to get startup capital from family investors. He'd even referred to me as his angel investor in one message, as if I were a business partner, rather than his mother, whom he was systematically deceiving. By noon, I had a folder an inch thick with printed bank statements, screenshots, and documentation. For the first time since seeing that photo in the doctor's office, I felt like I had some power back. Marcus thought he was dealing with a naive, grieving widow who could be easily manipulated. He was about to discover just how wrong he was. After gathering all my evidence, I knew I had two choices: confront Marcus immediately in an emotional outburst that would accomplish nothing, or think strategically, like the elementary school teacher who'd handled difficult parents and administrators for 30 years. I chose strategy. My first call was to David Chen, Robert's lawyer who'd helped me navigate the estate planning after my husband's death. David had always been straight with me, never talking down to me or making me feel foolish for not understanding legal complexities. When I explained the situation, his response was immediate and practical. "Linda, before you do anything else, you need to protect your remaining assets," David said firmly. "If Marcus has been this manipulative about money, there's no telling what other financial schemes he might attempt. We need to assume he'll escalate when confronted." David's advice was eye-opening. He explained that adult children often try to gain power of attorney over aging parents under the guise of helping with finances. He'd seen cases where manipulative children convinced parents to add them to bank accounts, then clean them out entirely. Even worse, some pushed for guardianship claims, arguing their parents were mentally incompetent to manage their own money. "The fact that Marcus has been systematically extracting money while you're still grieving shows calculated behavior," David continued. "Men like this don't usually stop until they're forced to stop." That afternoon, I opened a new checking account at a different bank across town. I transferred my remaining savings, about $47,000, into the new account and closed my old accounts entirely. I also moved my Social Security direct deposit and pension payments to the new bank. If Marcus was monitoring my finances somehow, he'd now find himself locked out completely. David helped me draft a formal cease and desist letter, documenting Marcus's deception with dates, amounts, and evidence. We also prepared a promissory note that would legally require Marcus to repay the money he'd taken. But David suggested something even smarter: letting Marcus dig his hole deeper before presenting the evidence. "Give him enough rope to hang himself," David advised. "Let him come back from his vacation and try to manipulate you again. Record the conversation if Colorado law allows, and let him lie some more. The more evidence of ongoing deception you have, the stronger your position becomes." The waiting was the hardest part. For 2 weeks, I had to pretend I knew nothing while Marcus finished his European adventure. He even had the audacity to send postcards to his loving mother, signed with hearts and promises to make it up to you when I get home and business picks up. But I used that time wisely, documenting everything and preparing for what David called the most important conversation of your relationship with your son. I was ready for war. Marcus called me the day after he returned from Europe, his voice carrying that familiar tone of manufactured distress that I now recognized as his signature manipulation tactic. "Mom, I'm so sorry I haven't called. The business trip was intense, but I think I might have landed a huge contract. The problem is, I'm in a real bind right now. My biggest client still hasn't paid, and I've got payroll due tomorrow. Could you help me out with maybe $5,000? I know it's a lot, but this could turn everything around for me." $5,000. After spending what looked like $20,000 on his European vacation, he wanted another $5,000 from his mother. The audacity was breathtaking, but I kept my voice steady and warm. "Of course, sweetheart. Why don't we meet for lunch tomorrow at Romano's? We can talk about everything then." Romano's was the Italian restaurant where Robert and I had celebrated our anniversaries for 20 years. It felt appropriate somehow. A place where I'd shared genuine love and trust. Now the setting where I'd confront someone who'd betrayed both. Marcus arrived 15 minutes late, looking tanned and relaxed in what appeared to be new clothes. He hugged me with what seemed like genuine affection, and for a split second, I almost wavered. This was still my son, the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. But then he started talking. "Mom, you look tired. Are you sleeping okay? I worry about you being alone in that big house." The concern sounded so genuine, so practiced. He was already setting up his next manipulation, positioning himself as the caring son worried about his aging mother. We ordered our meals, and Marcus launched into an elaborate story about his business trip to Europe. He'd supposedly met with international landscaping companies interested in American partnerships. The lies flowed so smoothly, with just enough detail to sound plausible, but not enough to be verifiable. The Porsche was a rental, he explained casually. My business contact insisted on making a good impression. You know how Europeans are about status symbols. That's when I reached into my purse and pulled out the manila folder I'd prepared. I placed it on the table between us, without saying a word. Marcus glanced at it nervously. What's that, Mom? Open it. His hands shook slightly as he lifted the folder's flap. The first document was a printout of his Instagram account, showing him with the Porsche, clearly displaying the car keys in his hand, and the caption about living his best life. Underneath that were bank statements, showing every transfer I'd made to his account over the past 6 months. Highlighted in yellow, Marcus's face went from tan to pale in seconds. Mom, I can explain. Keep looking. The next pages were screenshots of his Facebook messages, where he'd bragged about his angel investor and getting startup capital from family. Then came the hotel receipts I'd found through his tagged locations. The George V in Paris, luxury suites in Barcelona, first-class flights. This is, Marcus started, but his voice trailed off as he reached the final document, a timeline I'd created showing how every one of my money transfers coincided with an escalation in his vacation spending. The silence stretched between us as Marcus stared at the evidence of his own deception. Other diners chatted around us, clinking silverware and laughing, while my son's elaborate lies crumbled on the white tablecloth. Mom, you don't understand, he finally whispered, his voice now genuinely desperate. I was going to pay you back from the business deal. I just needed to make some contacts first, and… Marcus, my voice was steel. I'd practiced this moment for days, and I wasn't going to let him talk his way out of it. Stop lying to me. He flinched as if I'd slapped him. I know about the European vacation you planned months in advance. I know about the designer clothes and expensive restaurants. I know you told your friends that family guilt is worth its weight in gold. I know you used your dead father's memory and your children's supposed needs to steal $15,400 from your grieving mother. Tears were running down Marcus's face now, but I couldn't tell if they were genuine remorse or panic at being caught. Probably panic. You have exactly 30 days to repay every penny, I continued, sliding a formal promissory note across the table. If you don't, I'll be sharing all of this evidence with your ex-wife, your children when they're old enough to understand, and anyone else who asks why I no longer have a relationship with my son. Marcus's mouth opened and closed, like a fish gasping for air. For the first time in months, he was completely speechless. Sign the promissory note, Marcus, or get up and walk away, and we'll never speak again. The choice was his. Marcus signed the promissory note with shaking hands. But I should have known that wouldn't be the end of it. Men who manipulate their grieving mothers don't suddenly develop integrity when cornered. They escalate. The first call came that evening. Marcus had clearly spent hours crafting his counterattack, and his voice was no longer desperate. It was cold and calculated. Mom, I've been thinking about your mental state lately. You're clearly not processing Dad's death well, and now you're making these paranoid accusations about me trying to help you with finances. Maybe it's time we looked into some assisted living options. Assisted living. My own son was threatening to have me declared incompetent because I'd caught him stealing from me. The audacity was breathtaking. But David Chen had warned me this might happen. Marcus, this conversation is being recorded, I said calmly. Please continue explaining how wanting my stolen money back makes me mentally incompetent. The line went dead. The next attack came through his ex-wife, Jennifer, who called me in tears 2 days later. Linda, I'm so sorry to bother you, but Marcus says you're having some kind of breakdown. He's asking for emergency custody of the kids because he's worried about their safety when they visit you. I told him that was ridiculous, but he's threatening to take me to court if I don't support his claim that you're becoming unstable. I could hear the fear in Jennifer's voice. Marcus was using his own children as weapons, threatening their mother's custody arrangement to pressure me into backing down. Jennifer, I'm going to send you the same evidence I showed Marcus. You need to see what kind of man you're dealing with. When Jennifer saw the documentation of Marcus's lies and manipulation, her fear turned to fury. She called me back within an hour. That bastard has been telling the kids that you're sick and might not be around much longer. Emma's been crying herself to sleep, thinking she's going to lose another grandparent. He's been using their grief over their grandfather to manipulate them too. The next escalation came through my daughter, Sarah, who called me at midnight, sobbing. Mom, Marcus showed up at my house tonight, saying you've lost your mind and are making wild accusations. He says you're refusing to get help and that the family needs to intervene. He wanted me to sign some kind of petition about your mental competency. I could hear the confusion and pain in Sarah's voice. Marcus was systematically trying to turn my own family against me, painting me as a mentally unstable widow who needed to be controlled for my own good. Sarah, honey, I need you to come over tomorrow morning. Bring coffee, and I'll show you exactly what your brother has been doing. The final confrontation came when Marcus showed up at my house unannounced 3 days later, accompanied by a man in a suit he introduced as a professional who specializes in elder care transitions. I opened the door and looked my son in the eye. Marcus, you have 26 days left to repay the money you stole. After that, I'll be filing a police report for elder financial abuse. Now get off my property and take your friend with you. The man in the suit looked uncomfortable and quickly walked back to his car. Marcus stood on my doorstep for a long moment, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. The realization that his mother was no longer going to be his victim. You're going to regret this, he said quietly. No, Marcus, I replied, closing the door. You are. 3 weeks later, Marcus sold the Porsche. He didn't want to. I learned from Jennifer that he'd tried every other option first, including attempting to take out a loan, using his landscaping equipment as collateral, and even asking his drinking buddies to lend him money. But reality has a way of catching up with people who live in fantasy worlds. And Marcus finally understood that I wasn't bluffing. He returned $8,200 of the $15,400 he'd stolen. It wasn't the full amount, but David Chen advised me to accept it as a down payment rather than drag the family through criminal proceedings. The remaining $7,200 would come from a formal payment plan that garnished a portion of his business income each month. More importantly, Marcus had to sign a document admitting to the financial manipulation, which protected me from any future claims about my mental competency. The money wasn't really the point anymore, though. Something deeper had shifted in me during those dark weeks of confronting my son's betrayal. For the first time since Robert's death, I felt strong. I felt capable. I felt like Linda Morrison again, not just Robert's widow or Marcus's victim. The family dynamics took longer to heal. Sarah was devastated when she saw the full scope of Marcus's deception, particularly the way he'd tried to weaponize concerns about my mental health. My sister Margaret was furious that she hadn't seen through his manipulation sooner. Even Jennifer struggled with guilt over not warning me about Marcus's expensive gifts to the children. But the most important relationship to repair was with my grandchildren. Emma and Jake had been told so many lies about my supposed mental decline that they were afraid to visit me. It took months of patient conversations, gentle reassurance, and honest explanations about their father's behavior before they understood that loving someone doesn't mean enabling their destructive choices. Emma, now 15 and wise beyond her years, eventually asked me the question I'd been dreading. Grandma, why did Dad lie to you about needing money? I thought carefully before answering. Sometimes people get so focused on what they want that they forget how to be honest about what they need. Your father wanted an expensive vacation. But instead of working for it or saving for it, he chose to hurt people who loved him. That's not your fault, and it doesn't mean he doesn't love you. 6 months after the confrontation at Romano's, I was sitting in my back garden on a warm September morning when Emma came to visit. She'd ridden her bike over after school, something she'd started doing once a week since the truth came out. "Grandma," she said, settling into the chair next to mine, "I wanted to thank you for what you did with Dad." I looked at her in surprise. "Thank me? Honey, I hated having to expose what your father did." "I know," she said, her voice remarkably mature for 15. "But before, I was always confused about why Dad would say one thing and do another. Like, he'd tell us he couldn't afford pizza for dinner, but then he'd come home with expensive clothes. It made me feel like I was going crazy." Emma reached over and took my hand. "Now I understand that it wasn't about us. Dad was making choices that hurt people, and you stopped him. You taught me that love doesn't mean letting people walk all over you." Sitting there in the garden, Robert and I had planted together 30 years ago, holding my granddaughter's hand and watching the late afternoon sun filter through the maple trees. I realized something profound. I hadn't just protected myself from Marcus's manipulation. I'd shown my grandchildren what it looks like when someone stands up for themselves with dignity and strength. I was no longer just surviving Robert's death. I was living again, on my own terms, with boundaries that protected both my resources and my self-respect. Marcus had tried to make me his victim, but instead, he'd accidentally helped me discover that even at 72, I was still capable of fighting for myself. And that knowledge was worth more than any amount of money he could ever repay.